Hello, everyone. Yes, I am not a grad student anymore. Unfortunately, my student David, or my former student David, had COVID and couldn't make it, so I'm stepping in. Please don't ask me any questions. I would really appreciate that, although the talk will be a little short. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about David's last chapter of his thesis that he did before he graduated, which is I would not install an app with this label, privacy label impacts on risk perceptions when it's install iOS apps. I want to give a quick shout out also to my co-authors, Masood and Chris Kanich at UIC. So we all know privacy policies. I think we all have a pretty poor opinion of them. They're very detailed, they're very long, they're very hard to read. They go on and on and on, and it feels like you just went to CVS and you got a huge receipt for a $3 purchase of some gum. And this is a really hard task to do because we have a lot of information that we need to convey to users about how these apps actually function. There's a lot of legal things that go into that as well, but it's just way too much to ask users to be able to read things of this length and to be able to fully comprehend them. And so in reaction to this, there's been a lot of work on kind of simplifying the process through privacy nutrition labels. So there's been a lot of energy in the space regarding IoT, which makes a lot of sense because IoT devices often don't have full interfaces, so we want to be able to communicate about their behavior without necessarily a screen, for example. And the motivation behind this is food nutrition labels. So you may not fully understand everything that goes into the things you eat, but you should be able to look kind of clearly at a specification and have a decent understanding of what's in that product and how it works. So outside the IoT space, in 2020, Apple announced that they are going to require for all their new apps and updates to apps that they now have a privacy label specification, which came as, which soon after also Google for their Android apps followed suit. And I'll note that the privacy labels for Apple is not just on the App Store that is on your phone, but also on the App Store that's on your MacBook as well. So they're kind of pervasive, and there are a lot of different areas. And for those who aren't fully aware of a privacy label, this is kind of what it looks like. So at the higher order, there's something called the privacy type, which is of one of kind of 4 categories. Then there's a purpose, right? That purpose could be third-party advertising, a category of data that's being collected, for example, identifiers, as well as the type of identifier. In this case, would be a device ID. And there are 4 privacy label, privacy type areas. So there's, it's kind of actually harder to see than I thought. Data used to track you, data linked to you, and data not linked to you, and data not collected. And so if you still don't fully understand how this all works, that's normal. Most people, it's a fairly confusing process, and there's been not just us, but other people who have presented that this is not something that's been well understood by both users and developers in applying these labels. One thing that is relatively important to understand here, though, is that of these categories here, between data used to track you, linked to you, and not linked to you, these are mutually exclusive from the category of no data collected. So an app could either be no data collected, in which case it can't have any of the other 3, or it can have some combination of the other 3 with some presentation. It could have some data categories that are linked to you and some that are not linked to you and some that are used to track you and so on and so forth. But if you have data, no data collected, then that's the only thing you see. And this actually provides kind of a nice baseline to kind of compare how people might respond to having a label that's on the left side of your screen here compared to something that says, I don't do anything. Now, of course, I think it's important to note at this point, not just our research, but other people have shown that apps that say they don't collect data are almost certainly not accurate for a variety of reasons, and I can get into that if you want. But for the purpose of this experiment, it does provide a good baseline. And so what we were motivated by in this work is trying to figure out users' understandings of the labels in presentation. How does this label impact their willingness to install an app, and what is their impact on the risk perceptions of that app if they were to use it? And we looked at kind of 3 major research questions, so, but we really only have time today to present on 2 of them. So the first one will be like, how do users understand it, and their willingness to install and their change in risk perceptions. So let's get into the methodology. So we conducted a fairly large online study sample with 1,500 participants. It was very expensive, but very worth it. And the reason why we recruited so many people is that we were designing a relatively large kind of regression model. And in order to power that model across all the conditions, we actually needed a lot of participants. And we were motivated by a work by Pardis et al., who published a really great paper at Oakland in 21, where they actually did a very similar experiment on IoT labels, looking at the comparison of smart light bulbs, kind of like a non-complex thing, to something more complex, which is a smart speaker. And they were applying a single label to each of these, presenting it to a user, asking them a direct question, kind of quantitatively, like, how does this change your perception of the risk of using this? Would you more or less likely to buy this product or not? And did a fairly comprehensive regression analysis that we replicated in this study for privacy labels for apps as well. And so instead of a smart light bulb and a smart speaker, we looked at kind of like what we think is analogous products in the space of apps, which is like an app that is somewhat useful but shouldn't really need a lot of stuff about you, which is like a notepad app, like a kind of very basic app that you just save your notes, versus something like more complex, which in this case was a social media app. And so we did a between subject study of the app type. So if you were signing up for this study, you would either see only labels associated with the Notepad app or only labels associated with the My Friends app. So, and then we did a within subject treatment as well, where each participant reviewed 3 labels, and we tried to keep this relatively simple. So they would either see like a privacy type associated with a specific data category. So we didn't go all the way down to purposes, but just like, so you would see data linked to you, and the thing that's linked to you is your purchases, for example. And there were 43 of these combinations, and you would see a selection of 3 of those. Like, how would you feel if the Notepad app had this? And then we'd show you a different one. How would you feel if the Notepad app had this combination as well? And then we asked some questions about how well do you feel like you understood this label and what it meant for this app. How does it affect your risk perceptions of using this app? And does it change your willingness to install this app? So just kind of getting into the main results here. So we looked first at the privacy type. Remember, this is like data used to track you, linked to you, not linked to you, and then mutually exclusive with data not collected. And we do find that when we look at these results, most people seem to understand data not collected. Like 80% of people are moderately very confident that they understand what this means, but it's much less so when you get to some of the other privacy types. So we're only 50%, we're up to somewhat understanding. And if you go down into the data categories themselves, these are the things about like the kinds of stuff that are collected under this category. We found that 70% of the participants said they were confident in their understanding of what these mean. So there is some confidence, but what do they really know what this means it's hard, because there's a lot of different data categories that exist. So we definitely found that some were really confusing to users. For example, other data is a category. Who knows what that means? It can mean anything other than maybe the ones that are listed, but maybe not, who knows. But as well as diagnostic data was relatively confusing. People don't really know what it means to be diagnostic data, or sensitive info. Although even Apple has a definition for sensitive info, but like if you're a user just looking at this, like what does that really mean? As well as just identifiers, kind of like general identifiers, right? Like, why is that different than my name, for example? And people commented, we also had some small qualitative feedback. People commented on the vagueness of these. So one participant wrote, other data is so vague that I would be concerned, right? Even though maybe it's not that concerning, but the vagueness of it, the lack of description actually causes more anxiety than is needed. And I don't even know what constitutes diagnostic data. So there's a lot of there's some confidence, but also like a lot of misunderstandings of maybe what these things are actually doing. And so for the results for the risk perception and willingness to install, David built a huge regression table, which you should not try and read here, but I want to give you kind of a basic idea of what we did. So we built a cumulative link mix model with a baseline to data not collected and some other baselines as well. And what we tried to see is like, what is the impact, like how much more likely would you be to increase your risk perception or decrease your likelihood to install given that you saw a label on a given app. Very complex. Don't ask me any questions about it. David did it. So just to kind of give you some context of what this means. So for example, like one of the ones that had the largest effect was financial information. So if, for example, you saw that your financial information was tracked for advertising purposes, you were 11 times more likely to increase your risk perception and 642 times more likely to not install the app, right? And then you can see that kind of falls down. For other categories, it gets a little less as you move along. And I could go and present each one of these lines in general, but I think I would already bore you more than I am. So let me just kind of give it to you in like slightly different terms, which is like if you kind of look at the top of this, these are the things that cause some of the largest effect for people's risk perception. It's things that you might expect, like financial information, sensitive info, browsing history, other data, location, identifiers, contact information, search history, while things like diagnostic, which is less understood, which is kind of ironic, causes less concern because like diagnostic data feels like somewhat more natural for an app to do if you don't even know what that data is. And we saw very similar effects for willingness to install. So you can see again, financial information, sensitive info, other data, browsing history were the things that had some of the most impact, and again, at the bottom, diagnostic information. But one of the other things that you can actually observe in here is that there is this kind of trending downward as the privacy type, like from data track to not linked, kind of gets less invasive. You can kind of see this with the other data, that like other data like is like really weird to like, oh, you're tracking my other data, like makes people very anxious. But it gets less important when it's like, oh, you're collecting other data, but you're not really linking it to me. I don't know what that other data is, but like, you don't know it's my other data. Whether or not that can be verified or not, it's kind of meaningless. But like, you do see this kind of like downward trend. And we actually see that when we look at the actual privacy type themselves. We do also see kind of a downward trend towards like less concern, more willing to install when you look at one of these apps. But most importantly, when you're comparing to a baseline of an app that collects no data, we have this effect that is somewhat ingrained in the experiment, but also still important to note that like all labels, all categories impact the risk perception. People feel like it's more risky, and their willingness to install, they're less likely to install. So another way to think about this is that like applying these labels at all really should like make people want to use these things less. It's a fundamental question of like, is that really what we want privacy labels to do, like, or make people less likely to use things? I mean, it's kind of a fundamental question as well. But it also brings up this other issue, which is called the transparency paradox, which we didn't come up with, which essentially says that like when you take information where you give people all the information and you kind of synthesize it down, you get this paradox where you're trying to help people understand something more completely by giving them less information, but that less information makes things more vague and makes them more distrustful and unsure of what is actually happening as well. So just to kind of conclude this talk, kind of like two main takeaways is, the labeling that we do, all the labels have some sort of impact as well, some more than less, but they really do suffer from this transparency paradox of do users really understand them and understand their impact on installing apps? And as a result, the people suffer from a lack of confidence and understanding and using and making decisions based on these labels. As well as their accuracy remains a big question. I'm not the only one working on this, but it's not clear that like even if you did see these apps, you would be able to make good decisions based on them. And in many cases, people don't have a real choice. So like if you wanted to go park your car in a given garage, it's not like you can use the other company's app to pay for it, right? Like you're kind of stuck. So like what choices are we really giving users as well? And I think I'll end there, only 7 seconds over. So thank you so much.